The chandeliers sparkled like captured stars above the ballroom, their golden light spilling over gowns sewn with jewels and tuxedos pressed so sharply they seemed cut from steel. The city's wealthiest gathered in clusters of laughter and champagne, their voices blending into a polished hum. Waiters moved silently with trays of caviar and crystal flutes, the clink of glasses punctuating every conversation. And in the center of it all, hidden behind his father's tall frame, stood Adrian Sterling. He was 10 years old, but in that room filled with men and women who measured worth in millions, he felt smaller than his age. His father, Charles Sterling, the man who built towers of glass and stone across the city skyline, barely noticed him. Charles was busy shaking hands, flashing smiles that never reached his eyes, and boasting about his next billion-dollar deal. Adrian tugged once at his father's sleeve, but the man brushed him off gently as though his son were an afterthought at his own gala. So Adrian wandered. His small polished shoes tapped against the marble floor as he drifted toward the glass balcony, drawn to the glittering lights of the city stretched beneath them. Outside the towering windows, the skyline pulsed like a heartbeat, alive and untouchable. He pressed his palms to the cool glass railing, leaning forward for a better look. No one noticed him. No one ever really did. It happened fast, so fast, that silence swallowed the moment before anyone had time to scream. The metal groaned, a sickening twist that cut through the music. The railing gave way, and suddenly Adrian's body lurched forward, his small hands scrambling for purchase as his legs dangled over empty space. His cry tore through the air, high-pitched and raw, and for the first time that evening, every guest in the ballroom froze. Gasps echoed. A woman dropped her glass, the sharp crash of crystal exploding against the floor. Men stood rooted, staring at the boy swinging above the marble like a fragile ornament about to shatter. Adrian's knuckles turned white as he clung to the broken edge of the railing, his feet kicking at the void. Below him was nothing but 40 stories of darkness and concrete. "Adrian!" Charles Sterling's voice broke, sharper than any deal he had ever struck. He pushed forward, but the crowd was in chaos. Tables scraping, chairs toppling, people shoving back rather than stepping closer. The richest men in the city, the women who wore diamonds heavier than their purses, stood trembling, horrified, but unmoving. They clutched their pearls, covered their mouths, whispered frantic prayers. But no one moved. Not one. The boy's cry grew weaker, his arms straining. He could see their faces, faces painted with fear and indecision, but not a single hand stretched toward him. His eyes, wide and glistening, darted to his father's desperate figure. Charles screamed for help, his voice cracking in a way no one in that room had ever heard before. But his money, his power, his empire, none of it could stop the seconds from slipping away. Adrian's grip slid half an inch. The sound of tearing metal rang out like a warning bell. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to stall. The chandeliers still glittered. The music had died. The air itself felt frozen, and then it came, the silence that would haunt every witness in that room. A silence heavy with guilt, with fear, with cowardice. A silence that whispered the truth louder than any scream. No one moved to save the billionaire's boy. The ballroom had not yet breathed again. Conversations had turned into frantic whispers. Shoes scraped against marble as the wealthy inched back from the danger. And still Adrian dangled, his small body trembling with the effort of holding on. Yet, on the far edge of the room, almost, invisible to the glitter and perfume, another figure stood frozen for very different reasons. Elena Cruz clutched her daughter Sophia against her chest, rocking gently to soothe the baby's fussing cries. She was not supposed to be in sight of the guests. Maids were trained to move like shadows, clean, serve, disappear. Tonight she had been assigned to the back halls, wiping down corridors where no one cared to look. But the noise had drawn her, and now she stood in the doorway of the grand ballroom, the weight of her child in one arm and the weight of disbelief in her heart. Her eyes locked on the boy. 10 years old, maybe, with the same thin arms and wide, terrified eyes she had once seen on her younger brother, when a storm tore their roof away back home. His fingers clawed at the twisted railing, his body swaying dangerously. Elena's breath caught. Every instinct in her screamed go, but her feet hesitated. This was not her world. This was a room filled with wealth so blinding it made her simple uniform feel like a mark of shame. Sophia whimpered again, as if sensing her mother's racing heartbeat. Elena pressed her lips to the baby's forehead, whispering, "Shh, me. Vida." But her eyes never left the boy. Around her, the guests did nothing. One man barked orders to call security. Another muttered about liability. Women clung to their husbands' arms, trembling, but none dared take a step toward the breaking balcony. They were paralyzed by the risk, by the possibility of falling, by the knowledge that their lives were worth too much to gamble. But Elena's life had never been considered worth much by anyone. She was a maid, a single mother abandoned by a husband who had promised the world and given her nothing. She lived in a one-room apartment with peeling paint, barely affording milk for her daughter. Every day she scrubbed marble floors like these and served drinks she could never taste, all to earn just enough to keep her baby safe. And yet, standing in that doorway, she realized something the wealthy never would. Her life was not disposable, but it was not untouchable either. She took a step forward. The crowd barely noticed her at first, their eyes glued to the dangling boy. Charles Sterling, red-faced and frantic, shouted again, "Somebody, anybody, help my son!" His gaze swept over the sea of polished suits and shimmering gowns, but no one moved. Then his eyes landed on Elena, and for a brief second, confusion flashed across his face. Why was a maid stepping forward when men worth millions stood frozen? Elena adjusted Sophia in her arms. The baby's cry rose louder, sharp against the tense silence, as though protesting her mother's hesitation. And in that sound, Elena felt a fire ignite. She could not let a child fall while her own child watched from her arms. Her voice was soft but steady as she turned to the nearest maid and held out her daughter. "Hold her for me." The woman's eyes widened. "Elena, what are you doing?" But Elena was already moving, slipping through the circle of frozen elites, her uniform brushing against gowns worth more than she would earn in a lifetime. The crowd gasped, whispers tumbling over each other. What is she thinking? She'll get herself killed. Elena ignored them. Her heart pounded, her breath came sharp, but her steps did not falter. She was not thinking of danger, or of the billionaire watching with desperate eyes. She thought only of a boy about the same age her daughter would be one day, a boy who was about to vanish into the dark if no one acted. And in that moment, as Adrian's fingers slipped another inch, Elena Cruz became the only person in the room who dared to move. The room seemed to breathe in one collective gasp as Elena stepped closer to the broken balcony. Every diamond necklace, every polished shoe, every tailored suit turned in her direction, eyes wide with disbelief. They weren't watching a rescue. They were watching an impossibility. A maid, a woman who pushed carts of linens and polished their silverware, daring to do what none of them would. Adrian's small fingers clawed at the metal, slick with sweat, his face pale and strained. His voice cracked as he cried out again, "Help me!" His father lurched forward, but two security guards caught him by the arms. The railing groaned under Adrian's weight, and Charles Sterling, the billionaire who had built empires and stared down competitors with steel in his eyes, looked utterly powerless. Around him, the richest of the rich stayed frozen. One man in a tuxedo whispered, "Where's the fire department?" Another murmured, "They should have reinforced this balcony years ago." Their words were excuses, empty shields to justify their inaction. Some raised phones, recording the scene as though it were a spectacle instead of a child's life unraveling before them. Elena could feel the weight of their stares pressing into her back, judgment sharp as glass. Her hands trembled for only a second before she steadied them. She looked over her shoulder at the other maid holding Sophia. The baby squirmed, her cry echoing louder, almost demanding that her mother not falter. That sound tightened Elena's resolve. She stepped onto a chair near the railing, her worn shoes squeaking against the polished wood. The crowd gasped again, a ripple of shock spreading across the ballroom. "She's crazy," someone whispered. "She'll fall too." But Elena no longer heard them. Her focus was locked on the boy's terrified eyes. Adrian's grip slipped another inch, his knuckles bleeding from the jagged edge of the broken metal. He looked down and saw her, a stranger, a maid he had probably never noticed before, her face framed by loose strands of dark hair, her eyes burning with determination. For the first time since the railing gave way, hope flickered across his young face. "Hold on," Elena shouted, her voice sharp enough to slice through the chaos. The authority in her tone startled the crowd, silencing the murmurs for a brief, electrifying second. Charles Sterling's face twisted between fear and disbelief. "What are you doing? You'll kill yourself." His voice cracked, more desperate than commanding, but Elena didn't answer him. Her foot found the edge of the service cart, her body rising higher. Every muscle screamed with tension, but she pushed past it. The chandeliers above swayed gently as if holding their breath. Time slowed, stretching each heartbeat into eternity. For Adrian, those moments were unbearable. His arms ached, his body swayed, and the silence of the crowd pressed on him like a cruel weight. He could see their faces, all those glittering jewels and expensive fabrics, but not a single hand reached out, not one. The wealth of the city's elite filled that room, yet not a drop of courage flowed with it. Elena reached the railing, leaning out farther than anyone dared. She stretched her hand toward the boy, her voice trembling but strong. "Take my hand." Adrian's eyes filled with tears as he reached out, his fingers trembling, barely brushing hers. For a heartbeat it seemed impossible, the distance too far, his strength too weak. The crowd gasped again, some covering their eyes, unable to watch what they were too afraid to stop. The sound of metal straining filled the air, sharp and final. Adrian slipped. His scream pierced the silence, and in that frozen moment Elena lunged forward, her body arching dangerously over the void, her hand locking around his wrist just as his grip gave way. Gasps turned into shrieks. The room erupted, but none of it mattered, because now it was no longer just a boy hanging over the abyss. It was both of them, the billionaire's son and the maid who dared to move, dangling between life and death while a ballroom full of riches stood frozen in place. Elena's breath tore through her chest as she clung to Adrian's wrist, her knuckles whitening under the strain. The weight of him pulled hard, nearly wrenching her shoulder from its socket. The boy dangled in open space, his small body swinging against the void, while she leaned dangerously far over the shattered railing, the polished floor yawning below. Gasps and shouts rose like a storm behind her, but none of it mattered. The chandeliers trembled above as if the building itself was holding its breath. The boy's wide, tear-filled eyes locked on hers. His voice cracked with terror. "Don't let go." "I won't," she whispered fiercely, though her arms burned with the effort. Her voice carried a certainty her body barely felt, but in that moment, she knew she had to believe it for him, for herself, for her daughter who was watching from across the room in another maid's arms. Behind her, Charles Sterling shouted orders, his voice breaking into fragments. "Help her! For God's sake, someone!" But no one moved. The elite clung to, their fear like it was another jewel around their necks. They whispered of liability, of danger, of waiting for professionals. Their shoes stayed rooted to the marble. Their hands clutched glasses instead of reaching out. Adrian whimpered, his grip slipping against Elena's sweat-slick wrist. The heat in her muscles turned to fire, and for a terrifying instant, she thought she might lose him. In that flicker of despair, her gaze darted across the room, across gowns and suits and frozen stares, until it landed on the smallest figure in the crowd, Sophia. Her baby's cry rang out, sharp and piercing, louder than the gasps and the whispers, slicing straight through the chaos. That cry was Elena's anchor, her reminder of who she was. She was not just a maid, she was a mother. And mothers did not let children fall. Her jaw set, her teeth grinding against the pain. "Adrian," she gasped, tightening her grip, "you're going to climb. Do you hear me? Use your legs. Push up on the rail. Help me pull you back." The boy's sobs broke into frantic nods. He kicked his small shoes against the jagged metal, his legs trembling. Elena pulled, muscles screaming, her entire body bent. like a bow straining against the impossible. Their faces drew closer inch by inch until she could see every tear streaking his cheeks, every desperate breath that rattled through his chest. A man in the crowd cried out, "She's going to fall!" Another hissed, "This is madness." The words floated around them like smoke, useless and choking, but Elena blocked them out. All she heard was her daughter's cry. All she felt was Adrian's hand, tiny and fragile in her grip. With a guttural cry that came from somewhere deep inside, Elena heaved upward, pulling Adrian over the jagged edge. His body collapsed into her arms, knocking the breath out of her chest. For a moment, the two of them sprawled across the broken balcony, trembling, clinging to each other like survivors of a storm. The room erupted. Cheers and applause burst from lips that moments ago had whispered excuses. People clapped, some even wept, as if they had been part of the courage they had only watched. Charles Sterling pushed forward, his face pale and wet with tears. He dropped to his knees beside his son, gathering the boy into his arms with shaking hands. But in all the noise, in the thunder of applause and the flood of relief, Elena's eyes turned toward the other side of the room. There, her baby reached out tiny fists, her face red with sobs. Another maid rocked her gently, whispering in awe, "You did the unthinkable, Elena." Elena rose slowly, her body shaking from exhaustion, her arms aching with the phantom pull of the abyss. Her gaze swept the room, the faces of the rich, their jewels glittering, their eyes wide. And she realized she had changed something none of them would ever forget. No one had moved to save the billionaire's boy. But she had. And for the first time that night, silence fell again, not out of fear but out of recognition. The poorest woman in the room had just shown them what true wealth looked like. The roar of applause faded as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind a hollow echo that clung to the marble walls. For all their clapping and gasps of admiration, the wealthy crowd could not disguise the truth. They had frozen while she had acted. Elena felt it in the way their eyes slid away from hers the moment she looked at them. They admired her, yes, but they feared her too, because what she had done reminded them of what they hadn't. She was still kneeling on the fractured balcony, Adrian clinging to her as if letting go might throw him back into the void. His small hands dug into her uniform, his chest heaving in shallow sobs. Elena's arms trembled from the effort, but she pulled him closer, stroking his hair the way she soothed Sophia in the dead of night. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice steady though her heart still thundered. "You're safe now, I've got you." But even as she spoke, the jagged railing beneath them groaned, bending under their combined weight. The crack of metal sent a shiver through the room. Guests shrieked and stumbled backward, knocking over champagne flutes and candelabras, their fear more urgent now that the danger threatened to spill into their pristine world. "Get away from there," someone shouted. "The whole thing might collapse." Elena tightened her grip on Adrian. His father was close now, just a few feet away, his hands outstretched, but his body stopped short by fear and by the broken floor that separated them. Charles Sterling's face was pale, his usual confidence shattered. For once, the billionaire's wealth, his status, his power, all of it meant nothing. He looked like any father, desperate and helpless. "Give him to me," he begged, his voice cracking. But Adrian only clutched tighter to Elena, burying his tear-streaked face in her shoulder. "No, Daddy, don't let her go." The words cut the air like glass. The boy's instinct was raw and unfiltered. He trusted the woman who had reached for him when no one else did. Elena's chest tightened at the sound, and for the briefest moment she forgot the crowd, the danger, the tremors in her arms. She held him like he was her own. Behind them, the chandeliers swayed as if warning of worse to come. The balcony shuddered again, the split in the railing widening with a screech. The crowd gasped, frozen in place once more. Elena knew she had seconds, maybe less. She shifted, bracing her weight against the sturdier edge of the marble wall, her body shielding Adrian. The sharp bite of metal cut into her side, but she didn't flinch. She was thinking not of the pain, but of her daughter watching from across the room, her cries echoing like a heartbeat. "You're going to be fine," she murmured again to Adrian. though she wasn't sure if she was convincing him or herself. She pulled him upright, steadying him with every ounce of strength left in her body, and slowly began to edge them away from the fractured railing. Each movement was torture, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning, her legs trembling, but she forced herself forward. The crowd watched, silent now, transfixed. They could not look away from the maid carrying the billionaire's boy, as if they were witnessing a scene too impossible to be real. At last, with one final heave, Elena stepped onto solid ground. The marble beneath her feet no longer shifted. The railing no longer screamed. Adrian collapsed against his father, who pulled him into his arms with shaking hands, pressing frantic kisses to his son's hair. The room exhaled in relief, but Elena didn't bask in their admiration. She simply turned her head toward the far corner, where Sophia was reaching for her with outstretched hands, her tiny cries desperate and unrelenting. The sight broke something open in her chest. She staggered forward, arms aching, her entire body weak from the ordeal until she reached her baby. The moment Sophia was back in her arms, Elena finally let herself shake. She kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering promises no one else could hear. "I'll never let you see me fail. I'll never let you see me give up." And while the crowd whispered and Charles Sterling clutched his boy as if afraid he might vanish, Elena stood in the shadows again, holding her baby tight. But this time everyone in the room knew the truth. The richest among them had frozen, and the poorest had moved. And in that truth, the balance of the night had shifted forever. The ballroom was still vibrating with the aftershocks of what had just happened. Glass crunched under expensive shoes as waiters scrambled to clear shattered flutes and toppled chairs. Whispers rippled through the crowd, half in awe, half in shame, yet no one dared approach the woman who had done what none of them had. Elena leaned against a pillar in the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around Sophia. Her body trembled with exhaustion, every muscle still echoing the raw effort of pulling Adrian back from the edge. She should have felt relief. Instead, all she felt was the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on her like judgment. Charles Sterling knelt on the floor, a few feet away, clutching his son with desperation that cracked the mask of power he usually wore. Adrian's face was buried in his father's shoulder, but his small hand still reached back, searching for Elena. Charles tried to pry it away, gently whispering, "It's all right now, son. You're safe." But Adrian only shook his head, his voice muffled. "She saved me. Don't let them take her away." The murmurs grew louder. Some praised her bravery, others questioned it. "Reckless," one man hissed. "She endangered herself and the boy." Another whispered, "Imagine if she'd failed. Disaster." Their words weren't meant to carry, but they cut through the air sharp as broken glass, reaching Elena's ears. Her chest tightened, shame rising like a tide. She lowered her gaze, clutching Sophia tighter, as if to shield her from the poison in their voices. For a moment, doubt flickered. Had she truly done the right thing? If she had slipped, both she and the boy would have been lost, and her baby would have grown up without a mother. And then Sophia cried. It was not the weak fussing of an infant, but a piercing, soul-deep wail that filled the vast ballroom, louder than the whispers, louder than the scorn. Heads turned, some frowning, others startled, but to Elena that cry was a lifeline. It was her daughter's reminder that fear could not dictate her choices, that life, fragile and precious, was worth every risk. Elena pressed her lips to Sophia's forehead, breathing in the scent of her child. Milk, lavender soap, and something pure that even marble halls and chandeliers could not overshadow. She whispered, trembling but steady, "You're the reason I couldn't let him fall. You're the reason I will never let anyone fall." Adrian shifted in his father's arms, lifting his tear-streaked face. His small, shaky voice carried across the silence. "She was brave because of her baby. I saw it. I heard it." His eyes found Sophia, still crying softly against her mother's chest, and something passed between the children, a fragile, invisible thread that bound them. "Charles, Looked at Elena then, really looked for the first time. Not at her uniform, not at the role she played, but at the woman who had done what he, with all his power and money, had not been able to do. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Pride, gratitude, guilt, all wrestled inside him, leaving him mute. The crowd began to shift uneasily, their applause and cheers from earlier turning into quiet shame. They knew the truth. Their fear had been louder than their courage. And a poor maid with a crying baby had exposed it without ever meaning to. Elena straightened slowly, cradling Sophia with a dignity that no gown or jewels could match. She did not look at the guests, nor did she bow her head. Her eyes were calm, her step steady, as if the baby's cry had burned away every trace of doubt. And in that silence, something settled in the air, a truth no one could erase. When the chandeliers had swayed and the boy's life hung on the edge, it wasn't money or power or polished reputations that saved him. It was the cry of a baby and the courage of a mother who refused to let that sound become a song of loss. The ballroom, once alive with laughter and the soft clink of crystal, had fallen into a strange, uneasy quiet. The broken balcony had been cordoned off by hotel staff, its jagged edge covered with a white cloth as though draping it could erase what had just happened. But nothing could erase the image burned into everyone's mind. A maid, cradling her infant, reaching into the abyss to pull back the billionaire's boy when no one else dared. Yet instead of celebration, the silence was heavy. It was not the silence of reverence. It was the silence of discomfort. The kind that comes when mirrors are forced in front of people who would rather not see themselves. Elena sat on a low bench at the far side of the hall, Sophia nestled against her chest, her small body finally soothed into a soft sleep. Every muscle in Elena's arms and shoulders still ached, but it was the looks, those fleeting, sharp glances from jeweled eyes, that stung more. She was no longer invisible, yet the way they looked at her made her wish she still was. Foolish, someone whispered, their voice sharp as a blade, though hushed. She endangered the boy further. Another voice chimed in, clipped and disdainful. If she had slipped, we'd be facing a tragedy beyond repair. Elena lowered her gaze to Sophia, brushing her lips against the baby's forehead. Her daughter's breathing was steady, each small rise and fall of her chest a rhythm that calmed her own. She whispered to herself, I did what I had to. No one else would have. The words were soft, but they held steel. Across the room, Charles Sterling remained on his knees, still holding Adrian as though letting go would shatter him into pieces. His immaculate suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and the confident air he carried into every boardroom was gone. But when he looked up, when his eyes landed on Elena, there was a flicker of something new, something unsettled, something he didn't yet have the words for. Adrian, however, had no hesitation. He twisted out of his father's grip, wobbling on shaky legs as he made his way across the polished floor. His small shoes echoed in the silence. The guests stared, stunned, as the billionaire's son crossed the ballroom, not toward another man in a suit or a woman in diamonds, but toward the maid in the corner. He stopped in front of her, his voice hoarse from crying. Thank you. The words were simple, but they rang louder than the applause that had briefly filled the room earlier. Adrian's eyes darted to Sophia, and he added, with a seriousness beyond his years, She cried, and you heard her. That's why you saved me, right? Elena's throat tightened. She nodded slowly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Yes, Carino. That's why. The boy smiled weakly, then leaned forward and pressed his small hand against Sophia's sleeping form. The gesture was clumsy, but it carried a tenderness that melted the last of Elena's fear. Charles rushed forward then, his polished shoes clicking against marble. He pulled Adrian back a little too quickly, his protective instincts clashing with his confusion. His voice was low, almost pleading. Son, you don't need to. But Adrian cut him off, his words firm despite the tremor in his voice. She's the only one who helped me. Don't tell me I don't need her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The sharpness in the boy's tone was not what they expected from the air of Charles Sterling. Yet in that moment, Adrian sounded more like a man than the billionaires watching him. Charles's mouth opened, but no words came. Around him the murmurs grew again, dismissals, rationalizations, careful excuses designed to make them feel less guilty for doing nothing. But nothing could change what had happened. They could drape the balcony, they could whisper about recklessness, they could call her foolish. Still, the truth hung in the air like the weight of a storm. When the boy was falling, money froze, diamonds froze, power froze. Only a poor maid, guided by the cry of her baby, had moved, and that truth, though unspoken, made every wealthy guest in that room silently tremble. That night, after the glittering gala had dissolved into whispers and scandal, the Sterling penthouse was wrapped in silence. The city glittered beyond the massive windows, but Adrian Sterling sat curled on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. His fingers were still red and sore from clinging to that railing, the skin raw where the metal had cut him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again, his body swinging over the void, the faces frozen below him, the panic in his father's voice. But louder than all of it was another sound, the cry of a baby, piercing, urgent, alive. That sound had not just cut through the silence of the ballroom. It had anchored him, tethered him to the hands that reached for him. Elena's hands Adrian's father had told him to rest, to forget the night's chaos. Charles Sterling's voice had been brisk, commanding, trying to bury the cracks of fear under his usual steel. You're safe now. That's all that matters. But Adrian knew better. He hadn't been safe because of his father. He hadn't been safe because of the guards. He had been safe because a maid, a woman no one had even looked at twice, had moved when everyone else froze. So Adrian waited. When the mansion grew quiet and the hum of the city was the only sound, he slipped from his bed, his bare feet padded against the cold marble floors as he crept past the guarded hall, his small frame invisible in the vastness of the Sterling estate. He knew where she would be. He had seen where the maids disappeared after the galas, where their laughter and hushed conversations filtered faintly from the service quarters tucked in the back wing of the hotel. He followed the sound of a baby. There, in a narrow room with peeling paint and a single lamp flickering weakly, he found her. Elena sat on the edge of a narrow cot, gently rocking Sophia, humming a lullaby in Spanish, her voice soft and tired but full of warmth. The contrast was almost unreal. Less than an hour ago she had been dangling over death with him in her arms, and now she was simply a mother soothing her child. Adrian stood in the doorway, hesitant, his small shadow stretching across the dim floor. Elena looked up, startled, her dark eyes widening. "Señorito," she whispered, unsure if she should rise, if she should bow, if she would be punished for being found here. But Adrian only stepped forward. "Don't call me that," he said quietly. His voice shook, but there was determination in it. "I'm just Adrian." Elena blinked, her lips parting. He was the son of the man who owned towers, the boy draped in wealth. And yet, standing there, he looked fragile, stripped of everything but truth. He came closer, peeking at Sophia, who stirred but did not cry. "She's beautiful," he said softly, his eyes wide with a kind of wonder that children rarely show for babies. "When she cried out there, I think she saved us both." Elena's throat tightened. She pressed a kiss to Sophia's forehead before answering. "Her cry gave me strength. Without her, I might not have had the courage." Adrian nodded, then whispered, "I don't think I've ever heard anyone speak to me like you did. Everyone's always careful, polite. But you told me to climb and you didn't let go." For a moment, the silence between them was thick with something unspoken. He wasn't just thanking her. He was recognizing her. Elena's eyes softened. Sometimes, when life gives us no choice, we find a strength we didn't know we had. You were strong too, Adrian. You listened. You fought. Adrian shook his head. his small fists clenching. I was scared. Everyone else was scared too, but they just watched. They didn't move. His voice cracked, bitterness leaking into his young tone. I'll never forget that. Elena reached out, brushing his hair gently, the way she would have soothed her little brother years ago. Don't let anger stay in your heart, Niño. Fear makes people weak, but it doesn't mean they don't care. You cared. That's what matters. Adrian leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. He didn't realize until then how much he had needed someone to see him, not as an heir, not as a Sterling, but as a boy. That night, in a servant's room too small to fit the weight of such a moment, a quiet bond was born. The billionaire's boy and the maid's child, two worlds that were never meant to touch, began to weave together under the hum of a lullaby and the steady heartbeat of a sleeping baby. And though neither of them could know it yet, that bond would grow into something powerful enough to shake the walls of wealth and arrogance that had always kept them apart. The days after the gala blurred into one another. To the outside world, the incident became gossip, and embarrassment whispered over brunches and golf games. The broken balcony was repaired within 48 hours, the marble polished until no trace of disaster remained. For Charles Sterling, it was a scandal to bury. He instructed his staff, his assistants, and even Adrian himself. We do not speak of this again. But children remember what adults try to erase. Adrian couldn't forget. At night he still felt the air rushing beneath him, the emptiness clawing at his legs. More than that, he couldn't forget the way the crowd froze, their jeweled hands, clutching pearls and champagne instead of reaching out. He couldn't forget the way Elena had moved, fearless, holding nothing but the cry of her baby to guide her. So he began sneaking away. It started with one visit. One night while his father was buried in meetings on the top floor of the Sterling Tower, Adrian slipped out of his room and padded barefoot down the back staircases. He had memorized the path now, through the staff corridors past the laundry carts until the scent of soap and floor polish gave way to the faint hum of quiet voices. He found Elena in her small, dimly lit quarters. She was seated cross-legged on the cot, her dark hair falling loose as she hummed softly to Sophia, who giggled and tugged at her mother's necklace. When Adrian appeared in the doorway, Elena stiffened, almost rising to her feet. But Adrian smiled quickly, placing a finger to his lips. Shh. Please. Don't tell anyone, he whispered. Her eyes softened. Adrian, you shouldn't be here. I needed to be, he said simply. His voice carried the honesty of a child who didn't know how to hide truth. You saved me. I don't feel safe anywhere else except here. Elena hesitated, then motioned him in. He sat carefully on the edge of the cot, glancing down at Sophia, who blinked up at him with wide, curious eyes. For the first time in days, Adrian laughed, a small, fragile laugh that sounded like sunlight breaking through clouds. He touched Sophia's hand, marveling at the tiny fingers that curled instinctively around his. From then on, the visits continued. Adrian came with stories about the cold, cavernous rooms in his father's mansion, about the silence of dinners, where his father talked only of business, about the way he felt like a shadow in his own home. Elena listened, her heart aching with recognition. Though their lives could not have been more different, loneliness was something she understood all too well. In return, she shared pieces of her world. She told him about growing up in a crowded neighborhood where children played soccer barefoot in the streets. She described the way her mother's kitchen always smelled of garlic and cilantro, even when food was scarce. And she let him hold Sophia, teaching him how to support the baby's head, how to rock her gently until her giggles turned into drowsy sighs. Adrian began to sneak her small treasures from the Sterling estate, half-used crayons from his private tutor, picture books that had been gathering dust in his room, a set of toy blocks he had outgrown but knew Sophia would love. Elena protested, but Adrian only shook his head. They don't care if I use them, but you will. With each secret visit, the bond grew stronger. Elena became more than the woman who had saved him. She became a confidant, a gentle presence who looked at him not as a billionaire's heir but as a boy who wanted to be seen. And Sophia, with her curious eyes and endless laughter, became his friend, the only person who looked at him without fear or expectation. Yet even in those tender moments, a shadow lingered. Adrian knew that if his father discovered the truth, there would be consequences. Charles Sterling believed in order, in lines that were never to be crossed. For him, maids belonged to service, not to family. If he knew his son was spending his nights in the back halls with Elena and her baby, he would end it instantly. And so Adrian carried their friendship like a secret flame, hidden from the eyes of his father, nurtured in the quiet corners of the night. A flame that, though small, was strong enough to light the darkness of his young world. What none of them could know yet was that secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, never stay hidden forever. And when this one came to light, it would test the very walls that separated their worlds. The Sterling penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, but secrets had a way of slipping through even the tightest defenses. For weeks, Adrian's nightly disappearances went unnoticed. His father was too consumed with meetings, investors, and rebuilding the public image tarnished by the gala scandal. Charles Sterling believed problems could be erased with money and silence, and he assumed his son's quietness was proof that the boy was finally forgetting. But children carry truth in their eyes. One night, as rain lashed against the windows of the penthouse, Charles finished a late call and noticed Adrian's door ajar. His bed was empty, the sheets cold. Panic flared first. Memories of that balcony still haunted him, but it quickly hardened into suspicion. His son had been different since that night, withdrawn yet determined, hiding something. Charles followed the faint echoes down the hall. Through the back staircases he rarely set foot in. The further he went, the less polished the walls became. Paint chipped, lights dimmed, the corridors narrowing into the part of the building reserved for staff. His polished shoes clicked against the concrete floor until he stopped at the faint sound of laughter. It was Adrian's. Charles turned the corner and froze. There, in a cramped service room with peeling wallpaper, his son sat cross-legged on the floor. In his lap was a stack of toy blocks, and beside him Sophia gurgled with delight as she knocked them over. Elena sat close, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes soft as she watched the children play. Adrian laughed again, brighter than Charles had heard in years, a sound that twisted something deep in his chest. For a heartbeat, Charles did not move. He simply stared, the sight both alien and magnetic. His son looked alive here, more alive than he ever did in their glittering penthouse. But then the reality crashed in. His boy, his heir, was sitting on the floor of a maid's quarters, bonding with a woman who scrubbed his floors and a baby who had no place in his world. What the hell is going on here? His voice was thunder and the small room seemed to shake with it. Adrian jumped, his blocks scattering. Elena instinctively pulled Sophia closer, her body stiffening. Adrian scrambled to his feet. "Dad, wait." Charles's face was pale with fury, his jaw clenched so tight the veins in his neck bulged. "Adrian, do you have any idea what you're doing? Sneaking down here like some common child? With her?" His eyes cut toward Elena, sharp as knives. Elena rose slowly, cradling Sophia. Her chin lifted, though fear tightened her chest. "Mr. Sterling," she began carefully. "He's just quiet," Charles snapped. "You don't speak. You don't ever speak when it comes to my son." Adrian stepped between them, his small body trembling but unyielding. His voice cracked but carried fire. "Don't talk to her like that. She saved me, Dad. When no one else did. Not you, not anyone. She did." The words hit Charles like a slap. For a moment, his fury faltered, replaced by something raw and jagged. He had replayed that night 100 times in his mind. The moment his son dangled over the abyss, the way his own body had frozen. He had thought burying it would erase it, but hearing it from Adrian's mouth shattered the illusion. Elena held her baby tighter, her heart pounding. She wanted to defend herself, to shield Adrian from his father's wrath, but she knew this was a storm the boy needed to face. Charles's voice lowered, rough and trembling. "She put you in more danger. Don't You understand, if she had slipped, you'd both be gone. No, Adrian shot back, his eyes blazing through tears. If she hadn't moved, I would be gone. And everyone else just stood there. You stood there. The silence that followed was deafening. Rain pounded harder against the windows, echoing, the storm brewing inside the room. For the first time in his life, Charles Sterling had no words. His power, his wealth, his entire empire, none of it could erase the truth spoken by his 10-year-old son. And Elena, standing in the shadows with her baby, realized the lines between their worlds had just been drawn sharper than ever before. This was no longer about a rescue. It was about a boy who had seen through the illusions of wealth and a father who could no longer hide behind them. The storm outside had quieted by morning, but inside the Sterling penthouse, another storm raged, in silence. Charles had not spoken a word since dragging Adrian back upstairs. He had locked himself in his study, pouring whiskey into crystal glasses he barely touched, staring out at the city with eyes that no longer saw its towers. Adrian had gone to bed in tears, refusing his father's touch. Elena had been dismissed, back to her quarters, the weight of Charles's fury still heavy on her chest. But silence has a way of deepening wounds. Days passed, and Adrian withdrew. He no longer bounced through the marble halls or begged for stories from his tutors. His laughter, so bright when he was with Elena and Sophia, disappeared behind pale lips and quiet eyes. At first, Charles told himself it was childish sulking, the tantrum of a boy who had disobeyed. But then came the fever, the dizziness, the cough that rattled deep in his chest. One evening, Charles burst into his son's room to find Adrian trembling beneath the sheets, his skin clammy, his breaths shallow and uneven. Panic surged through him. "Doctor!" he barked into the intercom. Within minutes, a team of physicians filled the room, their expensive briefcases clicking open, their voices clipped and urgent. The lead doctor's verdict was grim. "Mr. Sterling, your son has an undiagnosed heart condition. It's delicate. Stress may have worsened it. If it progresses..." His voice trailed off, leaving the unspoken truth hanging heavy in the air. Charles's heart clenched in a way money could not soothe. His fortune, his towers, his influence, all of it was meaningless in that moment. He sat at his son's bedside, clutching the boy's small, trembling hand, whispering desperately, "Stay with me, Adrian. Please, son, stay." But Adrian turned, his face away. His voice, weak but sharp, cut through the room like glass. "I want her." Charles froze. "Who?" Adrian's eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever, but filled with stubborn fire. "Elena. I want Elena. And the baby." The doctors shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another, unsure of the name. Charles swallowed hard, fury and fear tangling inside him. "Adrian, she's just a maid. She can't..." "She saved me," Adrian croaked, his small chest rising and falling with effort. "You didn't. She did. Please, Dad. I need her." The words struck Charles deeper than any boardroom betrayal ever had. He wanted to argue, to reassert control, but the sight of his son's frail body silenced him. Pride had built his empire, but pride could not keep his boy alive. Hours later, when the fever spiked dangerously high, Elena was summoned in secret. She entered the grand bedroom barefoot, clutching Sophia to her chest, her face pale but determined. The doctors looked at her with skepticism, as if her presence itself were unprofessional. But Charles, desperate, said nothing. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, her free hand brushing the damp hair from Adrian's forehead. Her touch was gentle, practiced, the touch of someone who had cared for the sick long before this moment. She began humming softly, the same lullaby she sang to Sophia. The melody filled the sterile room, weaving warmth into the cold air. Adrian's breaths slowed. His trembling eased. His eyes, though heavy with fever, softened as they focused on her. As Charles watched, his chest tightening. He had hired the best doctors in the city, paid fortunes for their services. And yet it was this woman, this maid, that his son clung to for comfort. Later that night, when the doctors admitted they were struggling to stabilize him, Elena stepped forward. "Let me try something," she said quietly. Charles turned to her, his instinct to dismiss sharp on his tongue. But then he remembered the balcony, remembered the way his son had shouted the truth in his face. "She saved me when you didn't." "What do you mean?" he asked hoarsely. Elena's eyes were steady. "Before I came here, I was studying to be a nurse. I had to stop when Sophia was born, but I still remember. I know natural remedies, things my mother taught me. Let me help." Charles hesitated. Everything in him rebelled against the idea of trusting her. But the sight of Adrian's fragile chest rising and falling silenced that pride. Slowly, painfully, he nodded. "Do it." Elena worked with calm precision, crushing herbs she had kept hidden in her trunk, brewing a tea with steady hands. She whispered encouragement to Adrian, coaxing him to sip between shallow breaths. She cooled his forehead with cloths, her touch unyielding even as hours passed. Sophia stirred in her sling, her soft whimpers blending with her mother's humming, as if lending strength, and as dawn broke, the fever finally broke with it. Adrian's breathing steadied. His color returned. He drifted into a deep, healing sleep, his hand still wrapped around Elena's fingers. Charles sat in the corner, his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking. For the first time in decades, the great Charles Sterling wept. He wept not just for the fear of losing his son, but for the unbearable truth staring back at him. All his wealth, all his arrogance had crumbled in the face of a maid's love and courage. And in that collapse, something new, something humbler, something human, began to take root. Dawn spilled pale gold across the city skyline, filtering through the wide glass windows of the Sterling penthouse. The room smelled faintly of chamomile and herbs, not of sterile medicine. Adrian slept soundly for the first time in days, his breathing steady, his small chest rising with quiet rhythm. Elena sat beside him, her hand still lightly resting on his, as if she feared letting go would undo the fragile peace she had fought for through the night. Charles Sterling stood by the window, his reflection a stranger in the glass. His tailored suit hung loose, his tie discarded, his eyes hollow from hours of watching a maid do what the city's finest doctors could not. He had never looked so undone. He turned slowly, his gaze falling on Elena, and for the first time, it was not filled with fury or superiority. It was filled with questions he didn't know how to ask. "Who are you, really?" His voice cracked, low and unsteady. Elena glanced up, startled, then lowered her eyes back to Adrian. "I'm the same woman who scrubbed your floors yesterday, Mr. Sterling." "No." His voice was rough now, insistent. "You're not. I saw those hands last night. The way you worked. The way you calmed him. That wasn't luck. That wasn't instinct. That was training." Silence hung heavy. The truth pressed at her lips, but part of her wanted to swallow it, to keep the wall between their worlds. Yet something in Adrian's peaceful face gave her courage. "I was studying to be a doctor," she admitted softly. "I had 2 years left when life decided otherwise. Sophia came and her father left. I couldn't afford tuition anymore, so I cleaned houses, hotels, offices, anything that would put food in her mouth." She paused, brushing a curl from her baby's forehead as she stirred in her sling. "I still carry the knowledge. I couldn't let it go. It's all I had left." Charles blinked, as if the words didn't fit into the rigid structure of his world. A maid, meant to be invisible, had once been on the path to wearing the white coat of respect he reserved for the elite. The room felt smaller, the distance between them collapsing under the weight of her truth. Adrian stirred then, his eyes fluttering open. He saw Elena first, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You stayed," he whispered. "I told you I wouldn't let you fall," Elena answered gently. He turned his head toward his father, his voice weaker but clear. "Dad, she has to stay with us. Not as a maid, as family." The word cut through the air like lightning. Charles's chest tightened, his gaze flickering between his son and the woman cradling her child. Pride told him to dismiss it, to reassert control, to draw the lines that had always kept his world safe. But another voice, quiet, unfamiliar, rose inside him. It reminded him of the balcony, of the fever, of how powerless he had been while she moved with courage and love. Slowly, painfully, Charles lowered himself into the chair beside Adrian's bed. His hand trembled as he reached for his son's. "If that's what you want, then I'll listen." His eyes lifted to Elena's, and for the first time he bowed his head. "I owe you more than I can ever repay. You saved my boy not once, but twice. And now I know the truth. You don't belong in the shadows. If you'll allow it, I'll fund the rest of your education. Finish what you started. Become the doctor you were meant to be." Elena's breath caught, her eyes filling. With tears she hadn't let fall in years, she pressed Sophia close, her voice breaking. "Why? Why would you do that?" Charles looked at his son, then back at her. "Because my boy is right. You're not just his savior. You're ours. And I can't undo the arrogance that blinded me, but maybe I can start to put it right." The silence that followed was not cold this time. It was full, thick with something fragile and new. Adrian's hand found Elena's again, his fingers wrapping around hers with trust that no wealth could buy. Sophia stirred, her small cry filling the air once more, not with fear this time, but with life. And in that moment, the truth was undeniable. No one had moved to save the billionaire's boy until a poor maid with her baby did the unthinkable. And by doing so, she had not only saved a child, but shattered the walls that divided their worlds, leaving behind a bond stronger than wealth, stronger than pride, stronger than fear.